Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, November 15th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. 400 U.S. officials criticize President Biden's Israel policy. So more than 400 U.S. officials from 40 government agencies have sent a letter to President Biden criticizing his unconditional support for Israel's war in Gaza. And this is the latest example of dissent from within the U.S. government over this policy of backing this brutal onslaught in Gaza. So this letter reads, quote, "We call on President Biden to urgently demand a ceasefire and to call for de-escalation of the current conflict by securing the immediate release of the Israeli hostages and arbitrarily detained Palestinians, the restoration of water, fuel, electricity, and other basic services, and the passage of adequate humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip," end quote. So according to the New York Times, which obtained this letter, and this is a really interesting part, the majority of the signatories to this letter are political appointees who work throughout the government, including in the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the National Security Council. So up to this point, it's not exactly clear, but it kind of seemed like it was more of the people that work within the State Department at the lower level, that many of them could work there for many years, but they're not the ones actually appointed by Biden. But this says political appointees signed this letter, so it seems a little more significant. And some of the signatories helped get Biden elected and said that they were worried his support for the onslaught in Gaza is opposed by many Democratic voters. So basically saying a lot of Democrats that voted for Biden don't like what he's doing with respect to Gaza. And this letter says that the overwhelming majority of Americans support a ceasefire, and they cite a poll from Data for Progress that found 66% of voters believe the U.S. should push for a ceasefire, including 80% of Democrats. The letter said, quote, "Furthermore, Americans do not want the U.S. military to be drawn into another costly and senseless war in the Middle East," end quote. And we're seeing that happening with the attacks in Syria and Iraq and just the U.S. involvement in the Gaza war. I mean, how far is it going to go? So President Biden and his top aides have called for pauses in the fighting. They refuse to use the term ceasefire, really showing that they're committed to continuing this war. They don't want the war to end. So since October 7th, the U.S. has shipped weapons to Israel on a near daily basis and is providing special operations support, including surveillance drone flights over Gaza. So this is just an example of some of the things that these people are not happy about, that the U.S. is doing this unconditionally as Israel is killing so many civilians. And the latest numbers, they haven't really been updated much since the breakdown of communications between the hospitals in Gaza, as many of them have just completely ceased to be able to operate in any way, really. So, the death toll is still over 11,000, somewhere in the 11,000 range, and including over 4,500 children. But it's probably much higher with the thousands of people stuck under the rubble. And again, the breakdown of communications. So besides this new letter, so far there has been 3 dissent memos sent to Antony Blinken in the State Department, and there's also been an open letter signed by more than 1,000 employees of USAID. So again, this isn't just a few people. This is a significant opposition. So far, it's not having any impact on what the Biden administration is doing. And there's also that State Department official who resigned, actually, and spoke out pretty strongly against everything. All right, so the next one here, Israel raids Gaza's al-Shifa hospital. So this started just a few hours ago. These reports surfacing of Israeli forces actually entering the hospital complex and raiding it. And so I just put up the live updates from Al Jazeera just because this stuff is breaking and developing pretty quickly. And we'll just read through a few of these. I haven't seen the latest updates here. So the first update says that Gaza's hospitals are under sustained systematic assault, and that's from the Human Rights Watch official for Israel and Palestine is saying that. Israeli forces are in the emergency department at al-Shifa, according to an Al Jazeera correspondent. So this is from Tarek Abu Azum, who's reporting in Gaza. We've received an update from our correspondent, Tarek Abu Azum, who reports that Israeli forces have entered al-Shifa hospital and dozens of soldiers are in the facility's emergency department while tanks are stationed in the yard of the medical complex. He said, quote, the soldiers are inside the hospital. Meanwhile, the hospital is overwhelmed with patients, end quote. He added that medical staff have refused to abandon their patients, which includes a large number of newborn babies, as I've been going over. It says Israeli forces carrying out raids across the West Bank. That's a different situation over in the West Bank, but the violence has continued there. And so this is important. This update says that the Israeli raid on al-Shifa comes hours after the U.S. echoed Israel's hospital claims. So another thing that's important here is that Israel has actually announced that it is raiding the hospital. Remember when they used to say, we don't attack hospitals, but now they're conducting a raid against the hospital that they claim is on top of some sort of Hamas command center. So on Tuesday, the White House came out and backed Israel's claim that there is some sort of Hamas, that Hamas is using Gaza's hospitals. So White House spokesman John Kirby told reporters without providing evidence that Washington has information that Hamas is using Gaza hospitals, including al-Shifa. So the U.S. came out and backed the claim, and now Israel is raiding the hospital. So the U.S. is backing this raid on the hospital. So we'll see how this all plays out, but it just does not sound like a good situation. And if you remember what I covered yesterday, the doctors in the hospital, what they were saying was that they wanted to evacuate the patients. They would only leave if the patients were evacuated first. And I mean, I don't know. I'm sure Israel could have worked something out where they let the people, the patients evacuate. I mean, you would think. But we'll see how this all plays out. I'm sure, whether there is a Hamas, command center under the hospital or not, Israel is going to try to show us something that they say is evidence of that. But we'll see how the information war goes with regards to that. But this was the first time that the U.S. said specifically that Hamas was using this hospital. All right, so the next one here, Speaker Johnson calls the idea of a Gaza ceasefire outrageous. So House Speaker Mike Johnson, the new House Speaker, Republican from Louisiana, him and other members of Congress spoke at a pro-Israel rally at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, where the demonstrators made it very clear that they are opposed to a ceasefire in Gaza. Johnson called the idea of a ceasefire outrageous, prompting a chant of no ceasefire from the crowd. He said, quote, Israel will cease their counteroffensive when Hamas ceases to be a threat to the Jewish state, end quote. So this rally was a bipartisan affair featuring speeches from Democratic members of Congress, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Representative Richie Torres. He's a Democrat from New York. Senator John Fetterman, the new senator from Pennsylvania, Democrat, he was spotted in the crowd draped in an Israeli flag. So this guy Torres, who I don't really know much about, but apparently, he calls himself, he's a progressive. He said some of the most ridiculous things in his speech. He declared that support for Israel was an American value. He said, quote, the U.S.-Israel relationship is not just a Democratic or Republican value. It's not just a progressive or conservative value. It is an American value encoded in our national DNA, end quote. And he also expressed opposition to a ceasefire. He said, quote, I want to be crystal clear. A ceasefire with a terrorist organization is not a peace agreement. It is a death sentence for Israelis, end quote. And then Chuck Schumer, of course, expressed very strong support for Israel. He opened his speech by leading a chant of "We stand with Israel." He did some other chants. He said, quote, "America feels your pain. We ache with you. We stand with you, and we will not rest until you get all the assistance you need," end quote. So this rally came, just a few hours before Israel started raiding the hospital. All right, so the next one here, Ilhan Omar to introduce a bill to block a weapons transfer to Israel. So Representative Ilhan Omar is expected this week to introduce a bill to block an arms transfer to Israel. And this will be the first piece of legislation introduced that is aimed at reining in President Biden's strong support of Israel's brutal war on Gaza. The military aspect, at least, there was a resolution introduced calling for a ceasefire. Unfortunately, bills like this aren't going to get very far, but this will be interesting to see how much support it gets from Democrats. Although, apparently, to get for a vote on the House floor, this isn't a privileged resolution or anything. So in order for it to actually be brought for a full House vote, it needs to get past the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which that seems very unlikely. So this bill specifically targets a planned $320 million transfer of Spice Family gliding bomb assemblies, and they are kits that turn unguided bombs into precision-guided munitions. The Biden administration notified congressional leaders on October 31st that it intended to go through with the transfer amid Israel's onslaught on Gaza. So this bill is what is called a resolution of disapproval. It would block the transfer if approved by both the House and the Senate. But again, let's be realistic here. It's not going to pass. But, we'll see, because I do think the opposition is going to grow among Democrats just because of all the dissent that we're seeing from within the government, all the protests and stuff. So we'll see if this inspires more legislation like this. So according to CNN, U.S. officials told CNN that this $320 million transfer is part of an arms sale that was previously approved earlier this year. It's unclear if these kits were purchased by Israel using U.S. military aid or not. Israel gets $3.8 billion each year from the U.S., and $3.3 billion is in the form of what they call foreign military financing. That's a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S. weapons. So a lot of times you'll see a weapons sale to Israel, but they're not really spending their money on it. But it's not clear where the money came from for that $320 million deal. All right, so the next one here, Israeli members of the Knesset want the West to take Gaza refugees. So 2 members of the Israeli Knesset, that's their parliament, wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal arguing for Western countries to take in refugees from Gaza as Israeli officials continue to call for Palestinians to be pushed out of the territory. So this op-ed was written by Danny Danon, who's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, and Ram Ben Barak, a member of the opposition party Yesh Atid, which is led by former Prime Minister Yair Lapid. So the ruling party and the main opposition party unite to tell Europe and the U.S. to take in Palestinian refugees. They wrote, quote, "One idea is for countries around the world to accept limited numbers of Gazan families who have expressed a desire to relocate," end quote. And they listed examples of conflicts where Europe and the U.S. accepted refugees, including the wars in former Yugoslavia and Syria. They said, quote, "Looking to these examples, countries around the world should offer a haven for Gaza residents who seek relocation," end quote. They concluded the op-ed by saying that the international community has a moral imperative to accept refugees from Gaza, as Israel is killing all of these Palestinian children. They're saying this. I was looking at the numbers. According to the UN, 1.5 million people in Gaza have been internally displaced. So that means 1.5 million of their 2.3 million population have been forced out of their homes because of this war. And a lot of these people are sheltering in UN buildings that are also getting bombed, and schools, and they're sheltering in all these places, and disease is spreading. People are getting very hungry. So, as this thing goes on, I think we're going to start seeing people dying from those things. So this op-ed drew praise from Bezalel Smotrich, and he is an extremist settler who is in Netanyahu's government. He leads the religious Zionist party, and he is Israel's finance minister, and he also has a lot of control now over settlements, expanding settlements in the West Bank. He said, quote, "I welcome the initiative of members of Knesset Ram Ben Barak and Danny Danon on the voluntary immigration of Gaza Arabs to the countries of the world. This is the right humanitarian solution for the residents of Gaza and the entire region," end quote. So Smotrich said that other countries accepting refugees from Gaza is the only solution that will bring an end to the suffering. He added, quote, "The state of Israel will no longer be able to put up with the existence of an independent entity in Gaza," end quote. So it's very clear that the name of the game for these members of this Netanyahu government and many members of the Israeli parliament is to push all these Palestinians out of Gaza and take over the territory. It's clearly what they want to do. The Palestinian Authority's foreign ministry responded to Smotrich's calls for a voluntary migration of Palestinians, calling it a part of Israel's colonial plan. And we also know that the Israeli government is considering a plan to push out all of the Palestinians in Gaza, all 2.3 million of them, into Egypt, but Egypt is very against that. So here they're trying to say, let's spread them out all over the world so we don't have to deal with them. All right, so the next one here, Israel says that what we are doing in Gaza, we can do in Beirut. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and these are comments made by Israel's defense minister on Sunday that I don't think I covered. I know there's been similar comments made by other Israeli officials, but this is Israel's defense minister threatening to launch a war in Lebanon that would resemble the military operations in Gaza. So this was Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. He said, quote, "What we are doing in Gaza, we can do in Beirut," end quote. So that's a threat to Lebanon. And there's been, this exchange of fire across the border between Israel and Hezbollah. Many more have died on the Lebanon side, including some civilians and a journalist. And if you remember that report I went over the other day from Axios, that said that the U.S. is concerned Israel's trying to provoke a wider war in Lebanon. So keep that all in mind, if things really start escalating there, which, I saw today the Pentagon said that deterrence is working in the Middle East, that the war is not expanding. But if you live in southern Lebanon or northern Israel for that matter, that you're in a region at war. Anybody that's there would consider that there's a war going on. People have had to evacuate their homes on both sides of the border. So, this isn't just small skirmishes that are happening. Again, dozens, I believe over 60 Hezbollah fighters have been killed so far. So, it's not nothing, but it can definitely escalate, further. All right, so the next one here, Israel refuses Western requests to allow aid into Gaza through Israel. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. Officials in Tel Aviv have denied requests from some Western nations to bring aid into Gaza through an Israeli crossing. Israel has allowed a small amount of aid to enter Gaza via Egypt. And the aid that's making it into Gaza is only a tiny portion of what is required to prevent, a big catastrophe inside Gaza. So Israel is requiring that trucks pass inspection at the Israel-Egypt border before proceeding into Gaza through the Rafah crossing. In recent days, aid that flows into Gaza through Egypt has been slowed because of a backup inside Israel. So I didn't realize that Israel was inspecting it first as it went in. So basically, this is saying that there's been some pressure put on Israel to actually let aid in through an Israeli crossing, but they're saying, no, they don't want to take any responsibility. All right, so the next one here, evidence points to Israeli shells in strikes on Gaza's largest hospital. So this is an article from New York Times, and it is about these strikes on the al-Shifa hospital. One hit a maternity ward, one hit people sheltering outside the hospital, and there was a really horrific video that you see here of somebody, it looked like they lost their leg in the strike. And when these happened, it looked like Israel was blaming Hamas. They were claiming that they did not launch these strikes, but this investigation from the New York Times concluded that they did. So, there's a lot of detail here about the evidence that they reviewed and everything. But again, there was the maternity ward and the people sheltering at the main entrance. There was 2 strikes at the maternity ward. And all 3 of these strikes, they're saying, were Israel. All right, so the next one, I didn't really know there was a dispute there. I didn't realize that Israel denied that it was them. All right, so the next one here, 7 killed in the last U.S. airstrike in eastern Syria. So a U.S. official told Reuters on Tuesday that up to 7 people were killed in the U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria that were launched on Sunday and targeted Shia militias. So if this is confirmed, this is just the U.S. official speaking to the media, and they're saying up to 7 people were killed, so it doesn't sound confirmed. But if it is, this would be the first known deaths caused by U.S. airstrikes in eastern Syria since they started. And I should say first confirmed deaths, because there have been reports of deaths in other strikes, but they haven't been confirmed. And it's usually the case with these strikes on eastern Syria that the U.S. launches. It's usually tough to get a real number of how many people were killed. The Pentagon is saying publicly that they're still assessing the aftermath. Pentagon spokeswoman Sabrina Singh said, quote, "We are aware that there were IRGC-affiliated members in the proximity of the facilities that were struck by our aircraft, but I don't have more on casualty numbers or anything else to read out," end quote. And one more thing on this is that the attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria continued on Tuesday. The Pentagon says that the number of attacks has climbed to 56, and that is all under a month. The attack started on October 17th. And at least 59 U.S. troops have been injured, including 32 listed with non-serious injuries and 27 suffering from traumatic brain injuries. So those numbers will continue to climb as the militias are not backing down and saying that they're not going to stop until there is a ceasefire in Gaza, a lasting ceasefire. All right, so the next one here, no breakthrough expected at the Xi-Biden summit amid soaring tensions. So expectations are low for the meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping that will take place on Wednesday in San Francisco during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. That's the APEC summit. The New York Times reported Tuesday that Biden officials have said one potential agreement that might be made is to resume military-to-military communication channels that were suspended in the wake of then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan in August 2022. But even the increase in military dialogue is not guaranteed. The U.S. has previously framed its efforts to restore the communication channels as guardrails to manage the frequent encounters between the two militaries in the South China Sea and near Taiwan. From China's perspective, the U.S. effort to establish these guardrails will normalize the increasing U.S. military presence in the region. So the South China Morning Post reported that when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Washington last week, he scoffed when asked about military-to-military guardrails, saying that the best guardrail would be the U.S. adhering to the historical commitments that it made regarding Taiwan. In recent years, the U.S. has significantly increased military and diplomatic support for Taiwan, including providing military aid this year for the first time since the U.S. severed relations with Taiwan to formally establish ties with China, which officially happened in 1979. So this is a significant increase in U.S. support for Taiwan, and China's really not happy about it. China has stepped up its interceptions of U.S. and other Western aircraft in the South China Sea to show its displeasure with the military activity. The South China Morning Post quoted an analyst from the Eurasia Group, Dominic Chu, he asked how things would look if the roles were reversed. He said, quote, "If the situation were reversed, it is hard to imagine the U.S. would be inert if China's military operated 13 nautical miles off the coast of Los Angeles on a daily basis," end quote. So I remember in 2022, the U.S. flew around 1,000 surveillance flights over the South China Sea in 1 year. So one major impediment to U.S.-China military talks has been the sanctions on Li Shangfu, who was China's defense minister. He was removed last month. He was fired for some reason. He wasn't in very long. I believe he was appointed earlier this year. But he was sanctioned by the U.S. when he was at a lower level, and then they appointed him as defense minister. The U.S. wanted to hold a meeting between Lloyd Austin and Li, and China said no. And it's because of the sanctions, specifically because the U.S. refused to lift these sanctions. Even though they're claiming they want to foster more military dialogue with China, they wouldn't lift the sanctions. If you know anything about China, they would view that as just very disrespectful, and wouldn't want to hold a meeting, with an official that's sanctioned. So maybe his removal, maybe they could find a way to hold a high-level meeting. Right now, China's defense ministry position is vacant for the time being, so we'll see. Then there was also a report in Politico that said President Biden plans to press Xi on China's relationship with Iran, so that's going to add to the tensions even more. They're saying Biden's going to ask China to use its influence to prevent Iran and its allies in the region from escalating the situation into a regional conflict. Which, how is China going to respond to that when it's the U.S. sending all these aircraft carriers and backing this war so strongly? And then Kurt Campbell, who is the top Asia official on the National Security Council, and he's actually the nominee now to be Deputy Secretary of State. He's a real China hawk. He started what they called the Asia pivot during the Obama administration. And he had a quote, saying what he wants Biden to say in this summit. He said that the best thing for the U.S. to do is to, quote, make clear and to demonstrate to the Chinese that we still have staying power, that we are still the most powerful country, and we are still committed to our larger purpose in the Indo-Pacific, end quote. So that's the message he wants Biden to deliver to Xi Jinping. And China views all the U.S. efforts of building up its military, building up its alliances in the Asia-Pacific as containment aimed at China. And Xi Jinping has made that very clear in comments earlier this year. He said, quote, "Western countries led by the U.S. have implemented comprehensive containment, encirclement, and suppression against us, bringing unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development," end quote. And those comments were significant because before that, he would only kind of vaguely reference the U.S. and not name them directly when he said things like that. But there he kind of called out the U.S. So, just a lot of signs here that nothing good is going to come of this summit. Hopefully, something good comes out of it. Again, I think talks are good, but a lot of times lately it seems like they're just talking for the sake of talking. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Andrew Basevich. Is the U.S. an indispensable nation or reckless and misguided? One from Peter Van Buren. Did anyone ask you about war in the Middle East? One from Reza Benham. The catastrophic roots of Zionism in Palestine. One from Ted Snyder. The Zelensky paradox. And our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone. How Israel controls the narrative. Go check out our blog. So I appeared on the Ron Paul Liberty Report. It's at the top of the blog on antiwar.com. You can watch it on Rumble, on their channel on Rumble. You can watch it on YouTube. You can listen to they put it out in podcast form, audio only. It's about a half hour long. And I was interviewed by Ron Paul and Dan McAdams, two people that have been huge inspirations for me. It was kind of surreal doing it, and I think it went really well. We talked about my background a little bit, and kind of just the state of things, and it was just really, really cool. I was really happy to do it. They use my articles all the time on their show. It's just something I'm really proud of, to be helping them with their show in that way, and also to go on there. It's a really big deal for me. So go check that out and let me know what you think. But that is everything for me for today. One thing I almost forgot to remind you guys of is that I'm taking a day off this week, so there's only going to be 4 shows. So the show that I put out tomorrow will be the last one for the week. I'm taking a weekend to go up to New York, so lots of driving, so I'm not going to be able to work and do the show Friday, but I'll be back Sunday writing and recording to get you a show on Monday. But I'll still be back tomorrow. We still have one more show for the week. So you could always help this show out by sharing it. Comment, like, subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, wherever you prefer to watch. If you listen to the podcast, you could leave a rating or a review. That's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.